The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked slowly along the ancient stone pathways. His small hands were clasped behind his back, a habit he had picked up from watching his father during official ceremonies. The weight of his recent realization sat heavily on his young shoulders, making each step feel more deliberate than usual. Earlier that week, George had overheard a conversation between his parents that wasn't meant for his ears. They were discussing the mounting pressure from the media and certain royal advisors about his public appearances. Some believed he was too young to understand the gravity of his position, while others pushed for more formal training to prepare him for his future role. The adults spoke in hushed tones about protocols, expectations, and the delicate balance between giving him a normal childhood and preparing him for kingship. What troubled George most wasn't the talk of future responsibilities, but something he had witnessed the day before during a private garden party. A group of children from a local charity had been invited to the castle for tea and games. George had been excited to meet them, hoping to make new friends and play freely without the usual formalities. However, the afternoon had been carefully orchestrated with security personnel positioned at every corner, staff members monitoring every interaction, and photographers capturing predetermined moments. During the event, George noticed one boy about his age sitting alone on a bench, looking overwhelmed by all the attention and formal atmosphere. The child seemed scared and uncomfortable, constantly glancing around at the uniformed guards and staff members who surrounded them. George had wanted to approach him naturally, perhaps share his favorite toy or simply talk about football, but every time he moved toward the boy, an aide or security officer would gently redirect him to another planned activity. The moment that truly struck him came when the lonely boy accidentally knocked over his teacup, spilling it on the perfectly manicured lawn. Immediately, 3 staff members rushed over to clean up the small mess, making the child even more embarrassed and withdrawn. George watched as the boy's face turned red with shame, and he saw tears forming in the child's eyes. In that instant, George realized something profound about his position and the environment he lived in. That evening, as he lay in his bed looking up at the ornate ceiling of his room, George thought about the difference between his daily life and what he imagined a normal childhood might be like. He remembered stories his mother had told him about her own youth, the freedom to make mistakes, to explore, and to form genuine friendships without constant supervision. He began to understand that while his position came with incredible privilege, it also created barriers between him and the simple human connections he craved. The next morning brought another formal engagement, this time a visit from foreign dignitaries with their own children. George was expected to greet them in the blue drawing room, maintain perfect posture, engage in polite conversation, and represent the royal family with dignity. As he dressed in his formal clothes, helped by his personal dresser, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. The boy looking back at him seemed older than his years, already shaped by expectations and protocols that most children never had to consider. Walking toward the drawing room, George passed by one of the castle's many portraits of his ancestors. The painted faces seemed to watch him with knowing expressions, as if they understood the weight he was beginning to feel. He paused in front of a particular painting of a young prince from centuries past, noting how even as a child, the painted boy wore an expression of serious responsibility rather than youthful joy. His personal protection officer, James, had been walking a respectful distance behind him, as was customary. James was a kind man in his 40s who had been assigned to George for the past 2 years. Unlike some of the more formal security personnel, James occasionally shared stories about his own children and seemed to understand George's need for moments of normalcy. However, even James maintained the professional boundaries required by his position, never allowing himself to become too familiar or casual with the young prince. As they approached the drawing room, George could hear the voices of the visiting children through the heavy wooden doors. They were laughing and speaking in animated tones, clearly excited about their visit to the castle. For a moment, George felt a surge of anticipation, hoping that perhaps this time would be different, that he might be able to connect with these children in a more genuine way. But as the doors opened and he saw the familiar setup of formal seating arrangements, hovering staff members and carefully positioned security personnel, George felt his heart sink. The visiting children immediately fell silent when he entered, their natural enthusiasm replaced by nervous politeness. Their parents smiled and nodded approvingly, clearly having coached their children on proper behavior in the presence of royalty. George took his designated seat and began the rehearsed process of formal introductions and polite inquiries about their journey and interests. The conversation felt stilted and artificial, with each response carefully measured and appropriate. He watched as the children glanced frequently at their parents for approval, clearly more focused on not making mistakes than on actually enjoying the interaction. During a particularly awkward pause in the conversation, George noticed James standing near the doorway, maintaining his professional vigilance while occasionally glancing at his watch. Something about that moment, seeing his guard dutifully performing his role while George sat trapped in his own performance, sparked a realization in the young prince's mind. He began to understand that everyone around him, from the highest-ranking officials to the security personnel, was playing a role in a grand production centered around royal protocol and tradition. While these people genuinely cared about his safety and well-being, their professional duties created an invisible wall between him and authentic human experiences. The weight of this understanding settled over him like a heavy cloak, and George knew that something needed to change. The following afternoon, George found himself in the castle's extensive library, seeking solace among the thousands of books that lined the mahogany shelves. This had become his favorite retreat when the weight of royal expectations felt too heavy. The library's high ceilings and leather-bound volumes created an atmosphere of quiet contemplation that helped him think more clearly about his growing concerns. As he pulled down a book about British history, George discovered a section about young monarchs and princes from previous centuries. Reading about their experiences, he learned that many had struggled with similar feelings of isolation and the burden of expectations. Some stories told of princes who had rebelled against the strict protocols of their time, while others described those who had found ways to balance their royal duties with their human needs for connection and authenticity. One particular story caught his attention. It was about a young prince from the 19th century who had shocked the royal court by dismissing his formal guard during a public event, choosing instead to walk among common people without the usual barriers and protocols. The action had caused considerable controversy, but had also earned him great respect from the public, who saw it as a sign of his genuine desire to understand and connect with his future subjects. George closed the book and sat quietly in one of the library's comfortable armchairs, processing what he had read. He began to realize that his feelings weren't unique or unreasonable. Throughout history, young royals had grappled with the tension between their public roles and their private humanity. This knowledge gave him a sense of validation and courage that he hadn't felt before. That evening during dinner, George observed his family more carefully than usual. His parents discussed their upcoming engagements with practiced efficiency, coordinating schedules and discussing the various protocols required for each event. His younger siblings, Charlotte and Louis, seemed content to focus on their food and occasional playful banter, still too young to fully grasp the complexities that George was beginning to understand. When his father asked about his day, George almost shared his thoughts about the visiting children and his growing discomfort with the formal atmosphere surrounding his interactions. However, looking around the formal dining room with its elaborate place settings and the discreet presence of staff members, he realized that even family dinners were conducted within the framework of royal protocol. Instead, he simply mentioned his time in the library and his interest in reading about royal history. His mother smiled warmly and encouraged his interest in learning about their family's heritage. She spoke about the importance of understanding the traditions and responsibilities that came with their position, emphasizing how these protocols had been developed over centuries to maintain dignity and order. George nodded politely, but privately wondered if some of these traditions might have outlived their usefulness, especially when they prevented genuine human connection. After dinner, George retreated to his room and stood at his window, looking out at the castle grounds where several security personnel were conducting their evening patrols. The sight of these dedicated professionals reminded him of James and the other guards who worked tirelessly to ensure his safety. He felt a wave of gratitude for their service, but also a growing certainty that something needed to change in how he interacted with the world around him. The next morning brought news of an upcoming visit to a children's hospital, an engagement that George typically looked forward to. He genuinely enjoyed meeting young patients and hoped that his visits might bring some joy to children facing difficult challenges. However, As his private secretary briefed him on the protocols for the visit, George felt the familiar weight of structured formality settling over the event. The briefing included detailed instructions about which areas of the hospital he would visit, how long he would spend in each ward, what topics of conversation were appropriate, and how the security arrangements would be managed. Every aspect of the visit had been planned and coordinated with hospital administration, ensuring that nothing would be left to chance or spontaneous interaction. George listened to these preparations with growing unease. He remembered his previous hospital visits and how, despite the good intentions behind them, the heavy security presence and formal protocols often made the young patient seem nervous and inhibited, instead of the natural, comforting interactions he hoped to have. These visits sometimes felt more like carefully orchestrated performances for the benefit of the media and hospital administration. That afternoon, while walking through the castle gardens with James following at his usual respectful distance, George made a decision that would prove to be significant. He stopped near a quiet fountain and turned to address his protection officer directly, something that broke from their usual pattern of minimal interaction. James was initially surprised by the prince's direct approach, but maintained his professional demeanor as George began to express his thoughts about their upcoming hospital visit. The young prince spoke earnestly about his desire to connect more genuinely with the children they would meet, explaining his observation that the formal security arrangements sometimes created barriers rather than providing comfort. James listened carefully to George's concerns, recognizing the sincerity and thoughtfulness behind the young prince's words. As a father himself, he could understand George's desire for more authentic interactions, but he also felt the weight of his professional responsibilities to ensure the prince's safety and maintain appropriate protocols. The conversation between them was interrupted by the approach of other staff members, but something important had been established. George had taken the first step toward communicating his growing need for change, and James had listened with genuine attention and respect. This exchange planted the seeds for what would become a significant moment in the young prince's development. That evening, George lay in bed thinking about his conversation with James and the upcoming hospital visit. He began to formulate a plan that would require considerable courage, but might allow him to bridge the gap between his royal responsibilities and his human desire for genuine connection. The decision forming in his mind would challenge established protocols, but came from a place of authentic caring for others and a mature understanding of his unique position in the world. The morning of the hospital visit arrived with typical British weather, gray clouds threatening rain but holding back just enough to allow the scheduled outdoor arrival. George dressed carefully in his formal but age-appropriate attire, a navy blazer and crisp white shirt that struck the right balance between respectful formality and youthful approachability. As his dresser made final adjustments to his outfit, George caught his reflection in the mirror and took a deep breath. Steeling himself for what he had decided to do, the journey to the children's hospital took place in the familiar comfort of the royal vehicle, with James seated across from him and 2 additional security personnel in the front seats. During the 20-minute drive, George reviewed the briefing materials one more time, memorizing the names of key hospital staff, the layout of the wards they would visit, and the backgrounds of some patients he might meet. However, his mind kept returning to his growing conviction that something different needed to happen during this visit. As they approached the hospital, George could see the usual preparations that accompanied royal visits. Security barriers had been erected to control the modest crowd of well-wishers and media representatives who had gathered despite the relatively low-key nature of the engagement. Hospital staff in their finest uniforms stood ready to greet the royal party, their nervous excitement evident even from a distance. The car pulled up to the main entrance where the hospital's chief executive and head of pediatrics waited with warm but formal smiles. George stepped out and immediately fell into the familiar routine of greetings, handshakes, and brief introductory conversations with the senior staff. James and the security team positioned themselves strategically around the group, their professional vigilance creating an invisible but palpable boundary between the prince and his surroundings. The first ward they visited housed children recovering from various surgical procedures. George moved through the brightly decorated space, stopping at each bedside to chat with young patients about their interests, their recovery progress, and their hopes for returning home. The conversations were genuine and warm, but George couldn't help noticing how the children's eyes frequently darted to the security personnel stationed throughout the ward, clearly aware of the unusual nature of his visit. One particularly memorable interaction occurred with a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who was recovering from heart surgery. Despite her recent operation, she was remarkably spirited and immediately began telling George about her collection of stuffed animals that covered her hospital bed. Her natural enthusiasm was infectious, and George found himself genuinely laughing at her stories about the different personalities she had assigned to each toy. However, as their conversation continued, George noticed that Emma kept glancing nervously at James, who stood nearby maintaining his professional watchfulness. When Emma's mother gently suggested that she shouldn't keep the prince too long, George realized that even this delightful interaction was being influenced by the formal atmosphere created by necessary security protocols. Moving through the subsequent wards, George encountered similar situations. The children were universally welcoming and excited to meet him, but there was an underlying tension created by the formal setting and the visible security presence. Nurses and doctors, despite their best efforts to maintain normalcy, clearly felt the pressure of hosting such a distinguished visitor under such carefully controlled circumstances. The turning point came when they reached the ward housing children with long-term illnesses. Here, George met a 10-year-old boy named Marcus who had been battling leukemia for over a year. Marcus was clearly weakened by his treatment, but possessed a remarkable spirit and intelligence that immediately connected with George. They began discussing their shared interest in football, with Marcus enthusiastically describing his support for his local team, despite being unable to attend games during his treatment. As their conversation deepened, George learned that Marcus had been following news about the royal family and had particularly been inspired by stories of young royals who had shown courage in difficult situations. The boy spoke with surprising maturity about his own challenges and his determination to return to normal life once his treatment was complete. What struck George most profoundly was Marcus's observation about the number of adults surrounding them during their conversation. The boy mentioned with no complaint but clear awareness that it felt different from normal visits with friends and family. This innocent comment crystallized George's growing conviction that the security arrangements, while necessary, were inadvertently creating distance rather than comfort. After spending considerable time with Marcus, George excused himself briefly and approached James with a request that would challenge established protocols. Speaking quietly but with clear determination, George explained his desire to spend some private time with the children without the visible security presence that was making them feel nervous and self-conscious. James's initial response was professional concern about maintaining proper security protocols. But George's earnest explanation of his observations and motivations gave the experienced officer pause. The young prince articulated his belief that the security arrangements, while protecting his physical safety, were preventing him from fulfilling his deeper responsibility to provide genuine comfort and connection to children who needed it most. George proposed a compromise that demonstrated remarkable maturity and consideration for everyone involved. He suggested that James and the security team maintain their protective vigilance, but from a much more discreet distance, allowing the children to interact with him more naturally while still ensuring appropriate safety measures remained in place. The conversation between the prince and his protection officer was observed by hospital staff and other security personnel, who recognized that something significant was taking place. James found himself faced with a decision that went beyond standard protocol, requiring him to balance his professional duties with his recognition of the young prince's growing wisdom and genuine desire to serve others effectively. George's calm but determined presentation of his case reflected a level of thoughtfulness and maturity that impressed everyone present. His ability to articulate complex ideas about duty, service, and human connection, while maintaining respect for the security personnel's important role, demonstrated the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well in his future responsibilities. James stood in the hospital corridor, weighing the unprecedented request from the young prince against years of rigid security training and protocol. His weathered face reflected the internal struggle between his duty to protect and his growing recognition that George's request came from a place of genuine wisdom and compassion. The experienced protection officer had witnessed many royal engagements over his career, but he had never encountered such a thoughtful and articulate appeal from someone so young. Looking into George's earnest eyes, James saw not just a child making an impulsive request, but a future king beginning to understand the true meaning of service and connection with his people. The prince's calm demeanor and logical presentation of his case demonstrated a level of maturity that commanded respect, even from seasoned professionals who had dedicated their careers to royal protection. After a moment of consideration, James made a decision that would require him to trust his instincts rather than simply follow established procedures. He agreed to George's proposal, but with specific conditions that would maintain essential security while allowing for the more natural interactions the prince sought. The security team would reposition themselves at the ward entrances and maintain visual contact while giving the prince more space to interact freely with the children. George's face lit up with gratitude and determination as James explained the modified arrangements. The young prince understood that this decision required considerable trust and professional risk from his protection officer, and he was deeply appreciative of James's willingness to support his vision for more meaningful engagement with the hospital patients. Returning to the children's ward with the new security arrangements in place, the difference was immediately apparent. The children seemed more relaxed without the obvious presence of multiple uniformed officers in their immediate vicinity. Their natural personalities began to emerge more freely, and conversations became more spontaneous and genuine. Marcus, the boy with leukemia, was among the first to notice the change. His face brightened as he realized that their conversation could continue without the formal atmosphere that had previously surrounded the royal visit. George sat on the edge of Marcus's bed, and they resumed their discussion about football with the kind of natural enthusiasm that characterizes genuine friendship between children. Other patients in the ward began to approach more freely, drawn by the relaxed atmosphere and George's evident willingness to engage with them on their level. A group of children gathered around as George shared stories about his own interests and experiences, carefully avoiding topics that might emphasize the differences between their lives while finding common ground in their shared humanity. One particularly touching moment occurred when a shy 8-year-old girl named Sarah, who had been too intimidated to approach earlier, finally worked up the courage to show George a drawing she had made. The artwork depicted a castle with a smiling prince waving from a window, clearly inspired by her anticipation of his visit. George's genuine appreciation for her creativity and his detailed questions about her artistic process created a moment of pure joy that transcended any formal protocol. The nursing staff, who had initially been nervous about the modified security arrangements, began to see the positive impact of the change. Children who had been withdrawn and quiet during the formal portion of the visit were now laughing, sharing stories, and engaging with genuine enthusiasm. The more natural atmosphere allowed George to fulfill his role as a source of comfort and inspiration in ways that rigid protocols had previously limited. Dr. Elizabeth Thompson, the head of pediatrics, observed these interactions with professional interest and personal satisfaction. She had participated in several royal visits over her career and had always appreciated the positive impact these engagements had on her young patients. However, she was witnessing something different during this visit, a level of natural connection and authentic joy that exceeded her previous experiences. As George continued his rounds through the ward, he encountered children facing various challenges with remarkable courage and resilience. Each interaction taught him something new about strength, hope, and the human spirit. A 12-year-old boy recovering from a serious accident shared his determination to return to playing rugby despite his injuries. A 9-year-old girl undergoing treatment for a rare condition described her dreams of becoming a veterinarian with unwavering optimism. These conversations were no longer constrained by formal time limits or predetermined topics. George found himself learning as much from these brave children as he hoped he was giving them. Their perspectives on facing adversity, maintaining hope, and finding joy in small moments provided him with insights that no amount of formal education could have offered. The impact of the modified approach extended beyond the immediate interactions. Hospital staff noticed that other patients throughout the facility seemed to respond positively to news of the prince's visit. Children in other wards who wouldn't meet George directly were excited to hear from their friends about the natural, caring person who had spent time with them. James, maintaining his protective vigilance from a more discreet position, observed the transformation in both the children and the prince. His years of experience had given him a deep understanding of human nature and leadership qualities. Watching George navigate these interactions with such grace and genuine care, James began to see glimpses of the kind of leader the young prince might become. The decision to modify the security arrangements had required James to step outside his comfort zone and trust in George's judgment. As he watched the positive results unfold, he realized that the prince's request had been based on a sophisticated understanding of how his position could best serve others. This recognition would prove to be crucial for what was about to happen next. As the visit continued, George's confidence in his approach grew stronger. He began to understand that true leadership sometimes required the courage to challenge established procedures when they prevented the fulfillment of higher purposes. The positive response from the children, staff, and even his security team validated his belief that authentic connection and service sometimes required stepping beyond traditional boundaries. As the hospital visit continued into its second hour, word of the prince's natural and caring approach began to spread throughout the facility. Nurses from other departments found reasons to pass by the ward where George was spending time, hoping to witness the remarkable interactions that their colleagues were describing. The atmosphere of genuine warmth and connection was so unusual for such a formal visit that it captured the attention of everyone present. George's most profound encounter came when he met a 15-year-old girl named Rebecca, who had been receiving treatment for a serious spinal condition that had kept her hospitalized for several months. Unlike the younger children, Rebecca was old enough to fully understand the significance of meeting a member of the royal family, but she was also struggling with depression related to her extended illness and uncertain recovery prospects. When George approached Rebecca's bedside, he immediately sensed her different energy compared to the enthusiastic younger patients. She was polite but reserved, clearly questioning whether this royal visit was just another well-meaning but ultimately empty gesture from someone who couldn't possibly understand her situation. Her skeptical expression challenged George to prove that his concern was genuine rather than merely part of his royal duties. Instead of launching into cheerful small talk, George surprised Rebecca by sitting quietly beside her bed and asking her directly about her experience in the hospital. His mature approach and willingness to acknowledge the difficulty of her situation, rather than glossing over it with false optimism, immediately caught her attention. Rebecca found herself responding to his sincere questions about her treatment, her fears, and her hopes for the future. Their conversation revealed George's remarkable ability to listen without judgment and to respond with empathy that went far beyond his years. Rebecca began to share her frustration with the limitations her condition had placed on her life, her worry about falling behind academically, and her fear about how her illness might affect her future plans. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in understanding her perspective. What moved Rebecca most was George's admission that he, too, sometimes felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control, albeit very different ones. He spoke honestly about the pressures and limitations that came with his position, the difficulty of forming genuine friendships, and his own fears about living up to enormous expectations. This unexpected vulnerability from someone in such a privileged position created an immediate bond between them. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca's parents, who had been delayed by work commitments and had rushed to the hospital when they learned about the royal visit. George's interaction with Rebecca's mother and father further demonstrated his growing maturity and emotional intelligence. He spoke with them about their daughter's remarkable strength and resilience, acknowledging their dedication as caregivers and the challenges they faced as a family. Rebecca's father, a construction worker who had initially felt intimidated by the prospect of meeting royalty, found himself engaged in a genuine conversation with George about the importance of family support during difficult times. The prince's lack of pretension and his obvious respect for their situation created an atmosphere where normal social barriers seemed to dissolve. During this extended interaction, James observed from his discreet position with growing admiration for the young prince's natural leadership abilities. The protection officer had witnessed many royal engagements over his career, but he had never seen someone so young demonstrate such sophisticated emotional intelligence and genuine empathy. George was instinctively understanding what many adults struggle, to learn about connecting with people from different backgrounds and circumstances. The impact of George's modified approach was becoming evident throughout the hospital. Other patients who had initially been disappointed that they wouldn't meet the prince were now content to hear second-hand accounts of his caring interactions with their fellow patients. The positive energy was spreading beyond the immediate vicinity of his visit, creating a sense of hope and community that extended throughout the pediatric wing. Dr. Thompson, who had been observing the visit from a professional perspective, found herself moved by the genuine therapeutic effect George's presence was having on her patients. She had seen many celebrity visits over the years, some helpful and others merely disruptive. But this was something entirely different. The prince was creating real moments of connection and hope that would likely have lasting positive effects on the children's emotional well-being. As news of the prince's approach spread beyond the hospital, staff members began to recognize that they were witnessing something historically significant. The traditional formal protocols that had governed royal visits for generations were being gently but decisively modified by an 8-year-old who intuitively understood that true service sometimes required breaking from established procedures. George's decision to request modified security arrangements was proving to have implications that extended far beyond the immediate hospital visit. His actions were demonstrating a new model for royal engagement that prioritized authentic human connection over traditional formality. The success of this approach was evident in the calm, transformed atmosphere of the hospital and the genuine joy and comfort being experienced by patients and families. The prince's ability to maintain respect for security personnel while advocating for changes that better served the people he was visiting showed a level of diplomatic skill that impressed everyone present. James in particular was beginning to understand that his role might need to evolve to support this new approach to royal service. As the afternoon progressed, George continued to challenge conventional expectations while maintaining the dignity and respect appropriate to his position. His natural ability to balance innovation with tradition suggested that his future leadership would be characterized by thoughtful adaptation rather than rigid adherence to outdated protocols. The hospital visit was becoming a defining moment, not just for George's personal development, but for everyone present who was witnessing a young person's courage to advocate for meaningful change in service of others. As the afternoon wore on, George found himself in a conversation with a group of children in the hospital's recreational area, a brightly colored space designed to provide some normalcy and fun during their treatment. The relaxed security arrangements had allowed for a spontaneous gathering that would have been impossible under traditional protocols. Children from different wards had come together, some in wheelchairs, others walking slowly with medical equipment, all drawn by the opportunity to spend time with someone who genuinely seemed to care about their experiences. The conversation naturally turned to their various conditions and treatments, but instead of dwelling on the medical aspects, the children began sharing stories about their dreams and aspirations. George listened with fascination as a young girl described her plan to become a doctor, specifically to help other children like herself, and a boy with a chronic condition explained his innovative ideas for making hospitals more comfortable and less frightening for young patients. What struck George most profoundly was the resilience and wisdom these children displayed despite their young ages and difficult circumstances. Their ability to maintain hope, find joy in small moments, and think about helping others even while facing their own challenges provided him with a new understanding of courage and perspective. He realized that these children were teaching him lessons about strength and character that no formal education could provide. During this group discussion, George made an observation that would prove to be pivotal. He noticed that while the children were more relaxed with the modified security arrangements, they still seemed somewhat constrained by the formal nature of his visit. Despite James's efforts to be discreet, the underlying structure of a royal engagement was still evident, and George sensed that even greater authenticity was possible. After much internal deliberation, George made a decision that would surprise everyone present. He approached James and made an even more unusual request than his earlier one. Speaking with the quiet confidence that had characterized his actions throughout the day, George asked if he could spend a brief period with the children without any visible security presence at all, allowing for completely natural interaction without any reminders of his royal status. James's initial reaction was one of professional alarm. The request went far beyond the modifications they had already implemented and challenged fundamental principles of royal protection. However, looking at George's determined expression and considering the positive results of their earlier compromise, James found himself facing another moment of decision that would require him to balance protocol with his growing respect for the prince's judgment. George explained his reasoning with remarkable clarity for someone his age. He had observed that even the most discreet security presence created an underlying awareness among the children that this was a formal, unusual event, rather than a normal interaction between young people. He believed that a few minutes of completely natural conversation might provide these brave children with a sense of normalcy that could be genuinely therapeutic. The prince's proposal included specific parameters that demonstrated his awareness of safety concerns while still allowing for the authentic connection he sought. He suggested a brief period in the recreational area, which had limited access points and was already secured by hospital staff. James would remain nearby but out of sight, ready to respond if needed while allowing for completely natural interaction. James found himself in an unprecedented situation, being asked to make a decision that went beyond any protocol he had encountered in his career. However, the success of their earlier modifications and his growing recognition of George's wisdom and genuine motivations led him to consider the request seriously. The protection officer realized that he was witnessing something historically significant, a young royal's instinctive understanding of how to serve others most effectively. After a brief consultation with his security team and hospital administrators, James made a decision that would be remembered long after the visit ended. He agreed to George's request, but with carefully planned safety measures that would provide protection while remaining invisible to the children. The hospital's security team would maintain discreet monitoring, and James would position himself where he could respond immediately if needed, while staying completely out of sight. George's gratitude for James's trust was evident in his expression, and he clearly understood the professional risk his protection officer was taking to support his vision for meaningful engagement. This moment of mutual respect and understanding between the prince and his guard would prove to be the foundation for a new approach to royal security that balanced protection with authentic service. When James stepped away from the recreational area, leaving George alone with the group of children for the first time during the visit, the transformation was immediate and remarkable. The children's demeanor shifted from polite engagement to genuine excitement and naturalness. For these few precious minutes, George was simply another young person sharing conversation and laughter with new friends. The group began playing simple games and sharing jokes with the kind of spontaneous joy that characterizes normal childhood interactions. George found himself laughing more freely than he had in months, enjoying the simple pleasure of being accepted and liked for himself rather than for his position. The children, freed from any awareness of protocol or formality, showed him their true personalities and shared their most genuine thoughts and feelings. This brief period of complete normalcy provided George with insights into both his own character and the nature of authentic leadership. He realized that his ability to connect with others and inspire hope was not dependent on the formal trappings of his position, but rather on his genuine care for others and his willingness to be vulnerable and real in his interactions. James, watching from his hidden position, observed this transformation with professional fascination and personal admiration. He was witnessing a young person's instinctive understanding of how to balance the dignity of his position with the accessibility that true service required. The prince's actions were demonstrating that effective leadership sometimes meant having the courage to step beyond traditional boundaries in service of higher purposes. The few minutes George spent alone with the children passed quickly, but their impact was profound and lasting. When James quietly returned to the recreational area, he found a scene that validated every risk he had taken in supporting the prince's unconventional request. The children were animated and joyful in a way that transcended their medical challenges, and George himself seemed transformed by the experience of genuine, unguarded human connection. As the official visit concluded and farewells were exchanged, the difference in atmosphere was striking compared to typical royal engagements. Instead of the formal, respectful distance that usually characterized such occasions, there were genuine hugs, promises to stay in touch, and tears of sadness at the parting. The children had experienced something they would remember for the rest of their lives, not just because they had met a prince, but because they had connected with someone who had shown them authentic care and respect. Rebecca, the teenager who had initially been skeptical of George's visit, approached him as he prepared to leave. With tears in her eyes, she thanked him not just for visiting, but for listening to her concerns and treating her as an equal, rather than just a patient to be pitied. She told him that their conversation had given her renewed hope and determination to focus on her recovery and future goals. Marcus, the boy with leukemia, presented George with a small drawing he had made during their conversation. The artwork depicted two boys playing football together, representing his hope that they might meet again when he was healthy enough to play sports. George accepted the gift with genuine emotion, promising Marcus that he would treasure it and that he believed strongly in the boy's recovery. Dr. Thompson approached George as he prepared to leave, expressing her professional gratitude for the positive impact his visit had on her patients. She mentioned that she had never seen such authentic therapeutic benefits from a celebrity visit, and that the children's improved spirits would likely contribute to their healing process. The hospital's administrative staff echoed these sentiments, noting that the prince's approach had created an entirely new model for meaningful community engagement. The journey back to the castle provided George with time to reflect on the day's experiences and their significance. James, sitting across from him in the royal vehicle, broke from his usual professional reserve to express his admiration for the prince's wisdom and courage. The protection officer acknowledged that George's instincts about connecting with the children had been completely correct, and that the modifications to traditional protocols had enhanced rather than compromised the success of the visit. George used this opportunity to thank James for his trust and willingness to support an approach that challenged established procedures. He expressed his understanding of the professional risks James had taken and his appreciation for the protection officer's ability to balance security concerns with the higher purpose of serving others effectively. This conversation marked the beginning of a new level of mutual respect and partnership between them. As they arrived back at Windsor Castle, George carried with him not just the memories of a successful visit, but a new understanding of his role and responsibilities. The experience had taught him that effective leadership sometimes required the courage to challenge traditions when they prevented the fulfillment of higher purposes. He had learned that authentic connection with others was not just personally rewarding, but was essential to meaningful service. The impact of George's approach extended far beyond the immediate hospital visit. Word of his innovative engagement style reached other members of the royal family and palace staff, sparking discussions about how royal visits might be conducted more effectively in the future. The success of the modified security arrangements demonstrated that protecting the royal family and enabling authentic public engagement were not mutually exclusive goals. James's decision to support George's vision, despite the challenges it presented to traditional protocols, established him as a trusted advisor who understood the evolving nature of royal service. The protection officer's willingness to adapt his approach while maintaining essential security standards became a model for other security personnel working with members of the royal family. In the days following the hospital visit, George received letters and drawings from the children he had met, confirming the lasting positive impact of their interactions. These communications reinforced his belief that his position carried with it not just privileges and responsibilities, but opportunities to make genuine differences in people's lives through authentic human connection. The hospital visit became a defining moment in George's development as a future leader, establishing principles that would guide his approach to royal service throughout his life. His calm but impactful decision to advocate for more meaningful engagement had demonstrated wisdom beyond his years and courage that commanded respect from adults who had initially doubted his judgment. James's decision to walk away from traditional protocols in support of the prince's vision represented more than just professional flexibility. It symbolized a recognition that effective service sometimes requires trusting in new approaches and having the courage to support innovation when it serves the greater good. The protection officer's actions that day established a new standard for balancing security with authentic public Engagement. The story of Prince George's hospital visit and James's supportive response became an inspiring example of how thoughtful leadership and courageous support can create positive change that benefits everyone involved. Their partnership demonstrated that challenging established procedures, when done thoughtfully and with proper consideration for all stakeholders, can lead to more effective and meaningful service to others.